Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Forsyth County, Georgia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. The year was 1901, and the air across northern Georgia carried a dense stillness after a long, rain-soaked spring. The small community near Forsyth Manor had only recently begun to recover from what newspapers described as years of ruin and bad luck. Local records mentioned the collapse of trade routes, unexplained fires, and lingering disease in the wake of the Galveston hurricane the year before. While the storm had struck Texas, its refugees, tired, hungry, and lost, spread across the South, bringing with them stories of drowned towns and vanished families. Among them was a name that would soon haunt Forsyth County: Clara Forsyth. The Forsyth estate, standing on a gentle hill above the Chattahoochee River, had once been the pride of its county. Built in the 1870s by Colonel Edwin Forsyth, a Civil War veteran turned textile merchant, it embodied ambition and sorrow in equal measure. By 1901, its shutters hung uneven, its veranda sagged from neglect, and rumors filled the gaps left by fact. Local children called it the house that breathes, claiming to hear faint exhalations from its chimneys on windless nights. Clara, Edwin's only surviving daughter, returned that year after nearly a decade away. She had been educated in Savannah, later residing briefly in Galveston before the hurricane struck. County records show she returned to Forsyth Manor in March, accompanied by 2 trunks, a black cat, and an unfamiliar gentleman identified only as Mr. Alden, possibly a caretaker or relative. She looked pale as moonlight, recalled Mrs. Lavinia Parr, the postmaster's wife, in a 1902 affidavit, and she never smiled, not once. The house had been locked for years. When Clara reopened it, neighbors noticed she burned candles at all hours. A farmhand named Rufus Hale reported hearing furniture dragged and hammered late at night, though no repairs were requested of local carpenters. A letter found months later in Hale's pocket, unsent and water-stained, read simply, "They move in the rooms when she sleeps." By early summer, parish records show Clara rarely appeared in town. Only the milk delivery boy, Henry Cobb, claimed to see her in the window some mornings, standing still beside the drawn curtains. He described her as wearing mourning black, despite no notice of any recent death. Others whispered that she'd brought something from Galveston, something not entirely human. When Constable Merton Dawes finally visited the manor, after a missed census appointment in August, he found no sign of Clara, no Mr. Alden, and no cat. The only thing he noted in his report was a distinct odor of sea brine throughout the drawing room, an oddity for a house hundreds of miles from the ocean. Some of those first official notes preserved in county archives still bear the watermark of that same hurricane's year, a grim reminder that tragedies travel further than storms. By the time Constable Dawes filed his report, the manor had already acquired a new reputation. It wasn't merely a house left empty, it was said to remember. Townsfolk claimed the windows glowed faintly on certain nights, as though the lamps within still burned. The postmaster, weary of gossip, dismissed it all as moisture and fancy. But even he admitted that letters addressed to Miss Clara Forsyth continued to arrive, weeks after her disappearance, and none bore a return address. The Forsyth family papers, later catalogued by a junior archivist in 1910, painted a clearer though stranger portrait. Edwin Forsyth, the patriarch, had reportedly purchased maritime artifacts in the late 1880s, compasses, ledgers, and charts salvaged from wrecked Gulf ships. Some believed these items were among the possessions Clara brought back from Galveston. Her own diary, recovered in fragments from the manor's study, mentioned the water's voice and echoes in the metal. Though written in delicate cursive, the entries grew erratic toward the final pages. One line repeated in different inks, "It followed me inland." The nearby Chattahoochee Chronicle, a small weekly paper, ran a single paragraph on the case that autumn. It referred briefly to the ongoing reconstruction of coastal regions after the Galveston hurricane, noting that several displaced persons have vanished while seeking work upriver. The editor later testified that he had received a sealed envelope containing photographs of the Forsyth estate, unlabeled, grainy, but distinctly showing a figure standing beside the porch rail. head turned toward the camera. When examined under magnification, the face appeared smudged as though developed twice. Constable Dawes returned to the property on September 11, 1901, accompanied by Reverend Elias Cromer and the county clerk, Nathaniel Drew. Their account, filed 3 days later, described a manor in remarkable order for its vacancy. A faint scent of tallow candles lingered. The upstairs mirrors were draped in black gauze. In the parlor, Dawes discovered a set of muddy footprints, barefoot small, descending from the upper hall, but stopping short of the front door. Cromer insisted they perform a prayer of cleansing, which he described as met with a draught so cold it blew out every candle, though all windows were shut. Neighbors remembered the day vividly. Mrs. Parr, standing on her porch, saw the men leaving the property pale and wordless. When asked later what he had truly seen inside, Dawes replied only, "The sea was in her parlor." He resigned within a month. During the winter that followed, livestock near the Forsyth grounds were found dead but unmarked. A farmer named Jed Whittle swore he saw a woman in mourning walking near the fence line at dawn, her dress dragging the dew. He called out, thinking it might be Clara returned, but she vanished when he reached the gate. Whittle refused to plough the adjoining field afterward, and his family moved to Fulton County before spring. The Forsyth Manor was soon boarded again by county order. Its last recorded inventory listed 17 pieces of furniture, 2 portraits, and a locked trunk described as iron-bound, water-stained, emitting odor of salt. No one, at least officially, ever opened it. By early 1902, Forsyth Manor stood as an empty monument to unanswered questions. Local officials avoided the subject entirely. The few who still mentioned the case did so only in hushed tones at the back of the Methodist chapel or at the counter of Weller's General store. Rumor had already done what evidence could not: turn the estate into a place of quiet dread. A former deputy, Tom Beale, claimed to have guarded the property briefly after Dawes's resignation. In his later statement to county surveyors, Beale described persistent sounds like the sea pulling at gravel, though there was no nearby stream. He confessed to leaving his post after only 2 nights. "No man," he wrote, "ought to stand watch over something that never sleeps." His report, though considered unofficial, was filed among the same documents referencing the ongoing relief efforts for victims of the Galveston hurricane. It seems even administrative records could not separate the storm's shadow from the Forsyth tragedy. The manor's reputation soon attracted curiosity from outside the county. A young scholar from Atlanta, Professor Leland Graeber, arrived in June 1902 claiming interest in the estate's architectural lineage. He was later quoted in the Atlanta Journal as saying, "Forsyth Manor may yet reveal truths not of stone, but of inheritance." Graeber stayed at the boarding house of Mrs. Prue Cafferty, who noted that he spent long evenings copying entries from courthouse ledgers. On his second visit to the property, he persuaded the local carpenter, Evan Cole, to unseal the boarded door. According to Cole's recollection, recorded in 1911, they entered near dusk. The air smelled faintly metallic, and the walls were damp despite clear weather. Graeber took photographs using a large brass camera, each exposure requiring several minutes. Cole claimed he heard a whisper during one such exposure, like someone thanking me. The plates developed days later showed nothing unusual except a faint white curve near the hearth that neither man recalled seeing in person. When Graeber attempted to present his findings at the Savannah Historical Society, his slides were reportedly misplaced, and his notes partially burned in a boarding house fire weeks later. He never returned to Forsyth County, though a surviving letter to a colleague mentions a waterline running through memory itself. It was an odd turn of phrase for a man of science, but one that fit the whispers surrounding the manor. Through 1903 and 1904, the building deteriorated. Ivy crept over the veranda. Rain found its way through the eaves. Yet the county refused to demolish it, citing ownership ambiguity. Some believed Clara had never been declared dead, and without a death certificate, the estate remained in her name. A few documents from 1905 list her as missing, presumed deceased. Others curiously mark her residence as active, even decades later. The records retain that contradiction, a clerical ghost in ink, still haunting the courthouse drawers of Forsyth County. The year 1905 brought with it a dry, uneasy summer. The river shrank, the fields cracked, and Forsyth Manor, half hidden behind creeping vines, looked more like a ruin than a residence. Few passed that way anymore. Children dared each other to touch the front gate and run. None stayed long enough to see if anything moved behind the curtains. The county still paid a small stipend to have the grounds inspected quarterly, though it's unclear who performed those inspections. One invoice bears the shaky signature of Hiram Keats, a mason who later claimed he never set foot there at all. In August 1905, a letter arrived at the Chattahoochee Chronicle. It was unsigned but written in an educated hand. It began, "You neglect to record what the sea left inland. The manor is not empty." The editor dismissed it as a prank until the following week, when a mill worker named Elsie Granger disappeared while walking home after dusk. Her bonnet and a torn glove were found at the edge of the Forsyth property. No further trace of her was recovered. The sheriff's men searched the grounds, but reported no evidence of entry or struggle. The trunks in the hallway remained unopened, the iron-bound chest still locked and rusting. Newspaper gossip revived the story of Clara Forsyth, linking the girl's vanishing to the Lady of Mourning. A passing mention in a regional digest again compared the situation to the lingering displacement after the Galveston hurricane, remarking that the South has not yet rid itself of its wandering spirits, be they of flesh or sorrow. The parallel, while poetic, struck too close to home for those who remembered Clara's return from the coast. That autumn, Reverend Cromer organized a candlelight vigil on the Manor Road. Dozens attended, though none crossed the gate. As they prayed, witnesses later said the wind shifted suddenly, carrying a faint scent of salt and candle smoke mingled together. Mrs. Cromer fainted. 2 boys claimed to see a woman near the veranda railing, pale and watching. The Reverend wrote in his journal that night, "If that was not Clara, then it was grief itself given form." He never spoke of it again. By 1906, the county attempted to auction the estate, but no buyer came forward. A lawyer from Macon arrived to appraise the property and left the next day, saying only, "Some things aren't meant to exchange hands." He refused his fee. The courthouse clerk recorded the withdrawal without explanation. That winter, a traveling photographer named Benjamin Lowry captured one of the last known images of the manor. Taken from the distant hill, it shows the main house under a waning moon, a faint reflection in the upper window resembling a human silhouette. Lowry sold prints at fairs, calling it the Forsyth Spectre. Collectors would later note the strange consistency of a thin vertical line running through every copy, as if the negative itself had cracked under pressure. Forsyth Manor was soon left to weather and silence. Those who farmed nearby began to speak less of ghosts and more of curses of a place claimed by the memory of water that once drowned. Clay City, and somehow found its echo in the heart of Georgia. The winter of 1906 was unkind to Forsyth County. Ice settled on the riverbanks, and even the oaks around the manor seemed to groan under its weight. The local sheriff's reports for that season list a peculiar number of trespassing incidents, mostly young men trying to prove bravery by entering the abandoned estate. One of them, Samuel Pritchard, returned home trembling and mute, unable to speak for nearly a week. When his father finally coaxed words from him, all Samuel could whisper was, "There's someone upstairs," humming. His claim might have faded as local folklore, if not for a coincidental visit by Professor Graeber, the same scholar who had investigated the property years before. He had returned from a brief expedition along the Gulf, documenting post-hurricane migration routes. His journal, discovered decades later, notes that he stopped in Forsyth County to examine residual damage among inland estates, perhaps tracing displacement, patterns from the Galveston exodus. It is in that context that he revisited Forsyth Manor, an act that would seal his name to the legend that Graeber was accompanied by a photographer and a county clerk named Amos Veer. The group arrived in February, according to courthouse travel logs. They entered near midday, bringing with them lanterns, notebooks, and a phonograph device meant to capture environmental sound. Veer later testified, though the statement was suppressed, that the air within the house vibrated faintly, as though the walls themselves remembered a storm. The phonograph cylinder, now missing, was said to contain indistinct rushing. like wind and waves mixed with a woman's breathing. Midway through their survey, the men opened the parlor shutters to allow light. Graeber remarked on an odd shimmer on the glass, like a reflection from open water. The photographer, Mr. W. Cleary, took several exposures before one plate cracked spontaneously in its frame. They ended their work early and sealed the manor once again. Within weeks, Graeber developed a fever that left him bedridden for months. His surviving correspondence to Vere mentions dreams of water rising through floorboards and a woman singing an unfamiliar hymn. In the spring of 1907, Graeber relocated permanently to Savannah, where he gave one final lecture referencing the persistence of catastrophe in architecture. Those who attended recalled that he cited the Galveston hurricane not only as a natural disaster, but as a psychological contagion, spreading grief far inland. It was his last public appearance. He died the following year, leaving behind dozens of fragmented notes on acoustic hauntings and a pencil sketch titled CF, standing by the window. By then, locals had stopped even using the road near the estate. Wagons took the long way around, though it added nearly a mile to the journey. The few travelers who ventured close claimed that on calm days one could hear a low, rhythmic sound, like surf beneath the soil. In the years that followed, the manor decayed in silence, its shutters loose, its doors sagging, its name whispered only when someone new vanished in its shadow. By 1908, Forsyth Manor had become a boundary between memory and superstition. Travelers marked its location by silence. No one sang or spoke aloud while passing. The surrounding land, once fertile, had turned uneven and spongy, the soil retaining moisture long after rain had passed. Some said the water rose from beneath, not above. County surveyors avoided the region altogether, and maps from that decade leave the area conspicuously blank, as though omission itself could quiet the unease. In April of that year, the Chattahoochee Chronicle published a short piece titled "Forsyth Estate to be Reclaimed." The article announced that the county intended to auction the property once more. Among the interested parties was a merchant from Atlanta named Hollis Trent, who planned to convert the manor into a boarding school for girls. The idea horrified the locals. Reverend Cromer, still living though much aged, warned Trent in a public letter that certain foundations were never meant for the RCD living. The merchant dismissed it as provincial nonsense and arrived with a crew of 6 men to begin inspection in. Their work lasted less than a week. Notes from the county engineer mention that the crew refused to continue on account of the odor, though Trent himself recorded in a surviving letter that no smell persisted, only the feeling of damp lungs and restless air. The men boarded the house again, claiming the ground near the veranda had begun to sink. A portion of the eastern garden collapsed that summer, revealing a shallow cavity filled with brackish water. Within days, strange white deposits surfaced on nearby stones, salt, though the nearest coast lay hundreds of miles away. The phenomenon attracted one final visit from Constable Dawes, now retired and graying. He accompanied a state geologist who hypothesized that underground runoff might have caused the pooling. Dawes, however, remained unconvinced. In his private notes, later discovered in his family's attic, he wrote, "I know that smell. It is the ocean's rot, not rivers." He died in 1909, and with him ended any official interest in reopening the case. During those same months, fishermen along the Chattahoochee began reporting the appearance of small weathered boxes tangled in their nets. Each contained fragments of rusted metal, wax residue, and what appeared to be nameplates from vanished ships. The county clerk connected this incident to debris catalogued after the Galveston hurricane, though no formal explanation followed. Many of the fishermen refused to touch the objects again, throwing them back into the river as if returning something borrowed. By the end of 1909, Forsyth Manor had sunk further into obscurity. Ivy now blanketed the chimneys, and birds nested in the upper hall. Yet neighbors still swore the lamps burned on certain nights, glowing softly through the leaves like beacons beneath water. As the new century approached, the name Clara Forsyth slipped from documents and into whispers, less a person, more a presence woven into the soil that would not dry. No matter how many seasons passed, the first decade of the new century closed with Forsyth Manor half collapsed and wholly feared. The community had learned to live beside it, the way one lives beside an open grave, carefully, never looking too long. In 1910, county officials debated whether to demolish the ruins for safety, but a letter from the estate's attorney arrived unexpectedly, claiming, "The property remains in family possession, though no surviving heirs were ever confirmed." The name on the document, Clara E. Forsyth, appeared in familiar looping script, identical to the handwriting in her 1901 diary. Experts dismissed it as forgery, but no culprit was found. That same year, a new railroad spur was planned to pass less than a mile from the property. Survey teams described mechanical failures and compass malfunctions when approaching the area. Foreman Jacob Rowe reported that iron tools rusted overnight. He withdrew the crew and rerouted the track to the west. Officially, the reason cited was unstable ground conditions, though Rowe's personal note found years later in an estate sale read, "The land breathes. You can feel it underfoot." The nearby town of Cumming grew, roads paved, and new industries arrived, yet Forsyth Manor remained untouched, still marked private in land registries. In the same ledgers next to its entry appear faint pencil notes: salt bloom, water seep, and unconfirmed presence. County clerks often joked about the ghost in the ink, referencing documents that shifted dates or signatures without amendment. It became a quiet ritual. When new clerks began their tenure, senior staff warned them never to pull file Nudger 14B alone. In 1911, a traveling historian named Dr. Alice Rennard visited Georgia researching inland effects of coastal disasters. Her papers, now archived at Emory University, mention Forsyth County only briefly, describing it as a region where the echoes of the Galveston hurricane persist in unexpected forms, chiefly in human recollection and the strange retention of salt within the earth. She visited the Forsyth property with a local guide and described a silence that seemed alive. Her journal notes that she touched one of the exterior walls and found her fingertips coated with fine salt crystals, like frost in sunlight. Rennard's account revived public interest briefly. For several weeks, correspondents from Atlanta papers arrived hoping for sensational photographs. None succeeded. Their cameras malfunctioned, or the plates developed blank. One photograph that did survive shows only the gate, slightly ajar, the manor blurred behind a veil of fog. The caption reads, "House of the Sea Wind." By the end of that year, storms swept through Georgia again. Heavy rains collapsed what remained of the manor's upper floors. Witnesses claimed to see candlelight flickering behind broken windows, even as lightning tore through the roof. A farmer named Ellis Moore, who lived half a mile away, later told an insurance assessor, "The house didn't burn, it drowned." After that night, no one tried to enter again. The ruin was left to the vines and to the silence that had claimed it since 1901. The same silence that seemed somehow to breathe. The spring of 1912 brought new life to Forsyth County, but none to the manor itself. Wildflowers bloomed across the overgrown fields, and the faint outline of the house's foundation could be seen beneath a tangle of vines. It was during that season that two schoolboys, Matthew Klein and Oscar Bell, strayed onto the property while searching for arrowheads. Their teacher later testified that the boys returned pale, speechless, and drenched, though there had been no rain that day. When pressed, Oscar finally muttered, "We saw her in the window." She waved. By then, few still remembered the details of Clara Forsyth's disappearance, though her name lingered like humidity, present but invisible. Some of the older townsfolk drew parallels to those coastal refugees from the Galveston hurricane, whose stories of sudden loss and nameless graves had unsettled Georgia years earlier. They believed Clara carried the storm's sorrow home with her, a grief that soaked into the walls until the house itself began to remember the sea. In late summer, a traveling preacher from Alabama, Elder Silas Cope, announced he would reclaim the forsaken estate for God. Against all advice, he set up camp beside the crumbling gate, declaring 3 nights of prayer and fasting. Witnesses from nearby farms said they heard hymns drifting over the fields, followed by something heavier, waves, faint but rhythmic, as though rolling far underground. On the 3rd night, lightning struck a dead oak beside the property. When neighbors arrived, Elder Cope was gone. Only his tent and Bible remained, both soaked as if pulled from a river. The county sheriff at the time, Elias Morton, reopened the old files, but found little more than warped paper and fading ink. "Every page smells of brine," he noted in his ledger. His deputy reported finding a locket in the debris, inside which was a photograph of a young woman, believed to be Clara, standing near a beach with her hand resting on a wooden trunk. Written faintly on the back were the words, "It's quieter inland." The artifact was sent to the courthouse archive and soon misplaced. In 1913, the county finally fenced off the property. A small sign was posted, "Condemned ground, no trespassing by order of the county board." Despite this, tracks in the soil suggested people, or something, still moved through the area. Hunters complained of missing dogs. A mail driver, Harlan Copes, reported seeing lantern light one evening, moving steadily through the weeds, like someone walking underwater. By the decade's midpoint, the manor existed mostly in recollection. Teachers avoided mentioning it. Preachers warned against curiosity. Yet every few years someone new arrived. Historians, photographers, wanderers, each convinced they could make sense of the legend. All left with stories of damp air, strange sounds, and a feeling of being watched. Forsyth County moved forward, but its soil refused to forget. Beneath that stubborn ground, the waterline remained constant, as if the sea itself had drawn its own boundary, refusing to recede. The following spring, 1914, brought an unexpected stir in Forsyth County. Construction crews expanding the telegraph lines unearthed a section of cobbled foundation near the old manor grounds. Beneath the debris, they discovered fragments of glass, corroded metal, and a woman's shoe, its leather stiffened with salt. The foreman, Luke Marin, filed a short statement, noting the unusual residue. "White as frost, bitter to taste." The workers refused to continue. The site was filled and marked unstable. Around that same time, the Chattahoochee Chronicle published its final mention of the estate, describing it as a wound on the land that refuses to heal. The editor connected its decay once again to the Galveston hurricane, speculating that the displacement of the storm reached even the quiet inland counties, scattering more than mere debris. It was a poetic observation, but the connection would persist in later folklore. Clara Forsyth as the human echo of a disaster that would not end at the shore. That summer, new tenants briefly appeared. A widower named Ambrose Kettering purchased the property through a public deed transfer, intending to reclaim the estate's farmland. His correspondence with the county board shows optimism. "The soil, though damp, is rich. I shall drain it and make it yield again." By autumn, his letters changed tone, shorter, strained, almost pleading. The last, dated November 3rd, read only, "She won't let me." When neighbors finally investigated, they found the farmhouse door open and livestock wandering loose. Kettering was gone, his tools still arranged neatly on the workbench. The ground near the east fence had flooded overnight, despite no rain for weeks. Deputies noted the presence of a low mist clinging to the grass, cold enough to bead frost though the air remained warm. Within a month, the property reverted to county custody once more. The next year, 1915, brought more unease than tragedy. The nearby schoolteacher, Miss Fay Rowland, began recording odd dreams among her pupils, dreams of waves rolling through rooms and bells ringing under the floor. One child, Grace Whittle, claimed she saw a lady by the window in her sleep and awoke with her shoes soaked through. Miss Rowland dismissed it until she discovered the faint smell of brine on the classroom floor. Her diary, now preserved in the local museum, ends abruptly that autumn. In the following winter, the county records show only maintenance costs, fencing, signage, no further mention of habitation. Yet letters from nearby farmers describe an increasing dampness spreading across adjacent fields. One man wrote that his well water tastes like the Gulf, while another noted that his animals refused to drink it. These accounts were never formally investigated. By 1916, Forsyth Manor no longer appeared in property tax ledgers. It existed only as a shaded mark on the survey maps, an erasure both deliberate and fearful, as though the land itself had petitioned for silence. By 1917, Forsyth County was changing. The Great War had drawn many young men overseas, and the rhythm of the towns had quieted. The road past the old Forsyth Manor, once busy with wagons and mill carts, grew over with weeds. Locals said the stillness suited the land. It had always been a place that preferred silence. That spring, a letter surfaced in the county records office. It was addressed to the clerk, but bore no return address. The envelope contained a faded photograph of the manor as it had appeared decades earlier. Windows intact, the garden well kept, a woman in black standing at the porch. The handwriting on the back read, "Taken June 1901, I will wait until the tide returns." The clerk, Thomas Grant, filed it without comment under miscellaneous correspondence. During that same year, a small group of displaced families moved inland from the Georgia coast, seeking farmland after repeated flooding. They rented parcels near the old estate. One of them, Mrs. Nora Beck, recorded in her journal that her children often came home speaking of the lady in the reeds. She dismissed it as imagination until the day her youngest, Daniel, returned soaked to the waist and crying. "She said the ground is hollow," he told her. "She said it's breathing again." County inspectors later found no open wells or sinkholes nearby. The incident was noted, then forgotten. Yet Mrs. Beck's account became another thread in the growing folklore that the sea, through some impossible sympathy, still reached its hand into the Georgia hills. A preacher from Gainesville, when asked, remarked that the sins of water and blood have no boundary, again referencing the Galveston hurricane as if it were scripture. By autumn, heavy rain struck Forsyth County, flooding the lower farms. Witnesses claimed the old manor grounds filled first, as if drawing the water toward itself. One farmer described ripples traveling against the slope, water running uphill before seeping back into the foundation. When the rain finally ended, a single black glove was found floating in a puddle near the gate. Women's size, delicate stitching and salt-stiffened at the edges. In December, a brief article appeared in the Atlanta Constitution describing unusual subsoil salinity in northern Georgia. Scientists speculated that residual deposits from the hurricane's ocean spray might have drifted inland years prior, carried by storms. It was meant as reassurance, yet it only deepened the unease for those who had heard the manor's stories. The Beck family abandoned their farm by spring. Neighbors said they left before dawn, cart packed, house unlocked. A note on the door read simply, "We heard the waves again." After that, Forsyth Manor slipped once more into obscurity. Its story, now spread through rumor and half-truth, became part of the county's collective silence. Passed down in kitchens and barbershops, a warning told without conviction, as though the land itself listened for its own name. The year 1918 carried with it a somber heaviness. War news filled every paper, and influenza swept through Georgia with a quiet efficiency that reminded older residents of the same dread they'd once felt during the year Clara vanished. Death notices multiplied so quickly that the Chattahoochee Chronicle reduced them to initials. In the confusion, one peculiar entry slipped into print. CF, age unknown, Forsyth. The editor swore he never approved it. That winter, county workers clearing brush near the manor discovered what remained of the front steps. Beneath the cracked stone lay a rusted metal clasp, possibly part of a trunk, stamped faintly with the initials CF. The discovery drew brief attention before being shelved as coincidence. Yet it was enough to reignite whispers. Several older townsfolk recalled that Clara Forsyth had been declared missing, presumed dead precisely 17 years earlier, in 1901. The timing seemed almost deliberate, as though the land itself kept anniversaries. Around the same period, a schoolteacher named Eunice Danner began collecting local ghost stories for a cultural survey sponsored by the state university. Among them, she recorded what she called the Water Woman of Forsyth Hill. In her transcripts, witnesses described hearing the rush of tide in hollow rooms and a woman's voice calling for her father. Danner's notes include a single reference to the Galveston hurricane, framing it as a catalyst of inland sorrow. She suggested that survivors carried not only memories but lingering atmospheres, and which might explain why the manor continued to feel damp long after the rest of the county dried. Danner visited the ruins herself on June 3, 1918. Her journal recounts a calm afternoon, followed by an abrupt chill. The air changed as if I'd stepped beneath a wave. My skirts clung to my legs, though there was no moisture. She collected a sample of the soil, later describing its texture as fine as sand and faintly bitter on the tongue. The specimen was lost after her death from influenza that same autumn. As the epidemic worsened, no one returned to the site. Even funerals ceased. The county lacked men to dig graves. Families buried their own in shallow plots or, in some cases, not at all. The manor, half swallowed by vines, became a boundary marker for quarantine lines. Soldiers returning from Europe were instructed to avoid the region altogether. The few who ignored the warning reported sleeplessness and nausea. One, Private Harold Mays, wrote to his fiancée that the ground sweat salt here. By the time the epidemic faded in early 1919, the house was little more than a silhouette against the rising trees. The war had ended, the storm long forgotten, yet those who lived nearby said the air still carried a faint sound of surf at night, a whispering tide moving through fields far from any shore. By 1920, Forsyth County had stepped into a new decade, though the land around the old manor seemed stubbornly fixed in the past. The forest crept over what had once been gardens, and only a few warped fence posts hinted that people had ever lived there. The county survey that year officially reclassified the area as non-arable wetland, citing persistent subsurface moisture. Inconsistent with rainfall, few questioned it. No one wanted the property. Anyway, in the summer of that year, a traveling botanist named Dr. Warren Lyle visited the region, collecting soil samples for a study on mineral leaching. His notes mentioned the Forsyth ruins briefly. Site exhibits saline saturation unusual for interior Georgia, salt concentration comparable to coastal marshland. Source unknown. Lyle's assistant recorded that the ground emitted a faint hum when struck with a spade. They left the site after less than an hour, both reporting dizziness. The samples, later examined in Atlanta, corroded their storage tins within weeks. Meanwhile, local children began daring each other to walk as far as the gate. They called the figure said to haunt the place the drowned lady. One boy, Peter Nash, claimed she asked him for the time. When he told her it was near sunset, she replied, "Then I am late again." His mother found him the next morning sleepwalking toward the river, hands trembling as though cold. The physician diagnosed it as nervous fatigue. In that same year's Chattahoochee Chronicle, a nostalgic column revisited the Galveston hurricane, marking 20 years since the disaster. The writer reflected that some losses have no borders. Our inland homes, too, remember the sea. Though no names were printed, readers in Forsyth County understood what the article implied. Records from April 1921 reveal another disturbance. A road crew widening the county lane reported the collapse of a shallow sinkhole near the manor's edge. Inside, workers discovered fragments of porcelain and 2 glass bottles sealed with wax. The bottles contained cloudy water and a folded scrap of paper on which was written in faded ink, "She is not gone, only beneath." The bottles were sent to the clerk's office, catalogued, and never seen again. That summer, lightning struck the remains of the chimney. A fire spread briefly, but extinguished itself before reaching the trees. The rain that followed smelled, by multiple accounts, of brine and candle soot. Some took it as a final warning, others as a sign of release. But the air afterward, witnesses said, felt lighter, as if the land had exhaled. By the close of 1921, nothing of Forsyth Manor remained above ground. The site became a low marsh, its borders marked by reeds and the rusted gate half sunken in mud. Travelers sometimes paused there, noting how still the air seemed, how the sound of birds fell quiet the moment they stepped too close. Yet even then, a faint rhythm lingered, like the hush before a wave breaks, waiting for something that never comes. By 1923, the Forsyth estate was no longer mentioned in polite conversation. The few who remembered it preferred to call the site the Hollow Ground rather than by name. New residents, unaware of its history, treated it as an odd patch of wet soil unfit for farming. But every so often, something happened to remind the county that silence did not erase the past. That March, a surveyor named Merritt Lang was assigned to mark the new road alignment running near the old property. In his field diary, preserved in the State Archive, he wrote, "The instruments fail to settle, needle spins in circles, soil soft underfoot, smell of low tide." His assistant described hearing a faint melody that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Lang dismissed it as imagination, yet he noted it again a few days later. His last entry reads simply, "She walks at dusk," Weeks later, Lang's surveying chain was found coiled near the property gate, but Lang himself was gone. His disappearance drew only brief investigation. Records were sparse. Wartime demands had depleted the county's staff. It was assumed he had left for Florida, though his family insisted he had no such plans. Meanwhile, an enterprising journalist from Atlanta, Ira Daly, decided to write a feature on Georgia's vanished houses. His journey brought him to Forsyth County in May. Locals were reluctant to talk, but Daly managed to interview an elderly woman identified only as Mrs. Parr, likely the same postmaster's wife who had known Clara Forsyth decades earlier. In Daly's surviving notes, she is quoted saying, "That house drowned once. It just never stopped." Daly visited the site accompanied by a photographer, but both men reported a sudden failure of their equipment. Their negatives, developed later, showed only blurred streaks of light. Still, the article ran in the Atlanta Evening Herald under the title, "Where the Sea Forgot Itself." Though written with skepticism, it reintroduced the legend to a new generation of readers. For a brief period, Forsyth County saw a strange influx of visitors, students, poets and curiosity seekers, each hoping to glimpse the ruin that no longer existed. Among these was Dr. Samuel Bryce, a geologist from Emory University. His field report noted unexplained salinity in shallow wells near the old estate, and speculated that subterranean flow paths from the Gulf's ancient seabeds might be responsible. Yet his assistant added a curious detail in the margin: water samples clear but smell of wax and smoke. By late 1924, the county fenced off the hollow for good. Children were warned away, signs posted. The reeds grew taller each year, and fireflies gathered thick at dusk as if drawn to something unseen beneath the surface. Those who lingered too long said they could hear faint knocking sounds from underground, slow, rhythmic, patient, and sometimes, on the stillest evenings, a single ripple would disturb the waterlogged soil, as though something deep below had shifted or sighed. By 1926, Forsyth County was modernizing. Electric lines crept into the towns, automobiles hummed where horses once clopped, and talk of progress filled every meeting hall. Yet in the hills north of Cumming, progress halted at the same stretch of land that had resisted everything else. The marsh that had swallowed Forsyth Manor remained unclaimed, half hidden by cattails and mist. Locals called it Forsyth Hollow, and even the new maps refused to show contour there. That spring, a small oil company out of Birmingham sent prospectors to survey potential drilling sites across northern Georgia. One of them, Jasper Wren, wrote to his employer describing the hollow as a depression holding water but producing no reflection. He took soil samples but left abruptly after nightfall, claiming that the ground moved beneath the boots. His letter closes with a line often quoted since, "The sea sleeps here. Not gone, just dreaming shallow." County workers found his tent the next morning, undisturbed except for a circle of salt crust around its base. Wren never returned for his pay. His employer withdrew all interest in the site, stating that the land was unsound, spiritually if not geologically. Meanwhile, Forsyth County schoolteacher Eunice Cole, conducting a local history project with her students, collected oral accounts from elders who remembered the old manor. Several referenced a grey lady seen by moonlight, though none agreed whether she stood or floated. One account, given by a farmhand named Rufus Hale Jr., mentioned that his father once worked near the manor as a boy and used to say, "The house still breathes under the dirt." Eunice's students laughed when she read it aloud, yet she noted that the youngest child in class began to cry before anyone explained the story. That summer, a regional paper reprinted excerpts from earlier coverage of the Galveston hurricane, observing how the sea's losses ripple far beyond its coasts. The phrase struck a chord with readers familiar with Forsyth's folklore, reviving interest among academics. A folklorist from the University of Georgia, Dr. Millie Carver, arrived in July to document local legends of haunted geography. She found the hollow overgrown, the soil glistening faintly even under shade. Her report concludes with an understated remark. Moisture appears unaffected by heat, light, or reason. Carver stayed 2 nights at a boarding house in town, where she interviewed residents. One elderly man told her, "That land ain't cursed, it's remembering." She included the quote in her paper, published the next year under the title Echoes of the Inland Sea. The work was praised for its restraint, but criticized for blurring the line between folklore and fact. By autumn of 1926, the hollow had become a quiet boundary once again, an outline where sounds seemed to falter. Travelers said that their footsteps softened there, as though the earth itself was listening. Some described hearing a faint song in the reeds, no words, only rhythm, steady, patient, endless, like the pull of a tide that could never quite return. By 1928, the story of Forsyth Hollow had spread beyond Georgia. Traveling preachers used it as a cautionary tale, warning congregations that memory itself can sour a place. A few even claimed the site was cursed by the sorrow of unburied voices. For the locals, the legend was less a curse than a reminder, proof that some things simply never dry out. That year's summer brought a drought to much of the south. Yet in the hollow, the ground remained damp. A visiting hydrologist, Dr. Benjamin Falk, noted the phenomenon in his field notes: persistent groundwater despite extended heat, no inflow, no outlet, composition saline. His report was submitted to the state but filed without follow-up. The clerk who handled it later confessed to burning the copy after hours, claiming the paper smelled of fish and wax. In October, an itinerant painter named Clarence Dodd arrived in Cumming. He was known for his landscapes of abandoned towns and derelict homesteads. Locals warned him about the hollow, but Dodd laughed it off, saying he'd paint worse things than fog. He camped on the ridge for 3 nights, sketching by lantern. When he returned to town, he carried only one finished canvas, a grey wash of trees, water, and a faint white shape near the centre. Dodd insisted the form appeared after he finished painting. "It wasn't there when I set my brush," he told the innkeeper, "but now she's looking straight at me." He left the next morning and was never seen again. His painting, titled Stillness, Forsyth County, eventually found its way into a Savannah gallery, where viewers remarked on the illusion that the figure's eyes followed them around the room. A restoration decades later would reveal grains of salt embedded in the paint itself. That winter, a violent storm struck the region, the worst since the Galveston hurricane 28 years earlier. Winds uprooted trees and flooded creeks, but Forsyth Hollow bore the brunt. The next morning, witnesses found the hollow filled to its rim with water, shimmering like a false lake. For a few days it mirrored the sky perfectly, calm and glassy. Then, without rain or runoff, it began to drain away. By the week's end, only damp earth remained, and at its center, a single object protruded from the muck. A silver brooch engraved with the initials CF. The artifact was handed to the courthouse for safekeeping. It vanished within a month. The clerk who recorded its arrival resigned shortly after, writing in his resignation letter, "Every time I touched it, I heard the sea." By spring of 1929, Forsyth Hollow was dry again. The reeds returned, the mist thinned, and the locals went back to silence. Yet those who lived nearby said that at night, when the air was too still and too clear, they could hear faint tapping beneath the soil, steady, deliberate, as if someone below were counting the years. By 1931, Forsyth Hollow had nearly vanished from conversation, replaced by newer tragedies and the Great Depression's hardships. Families struggled to keep farms alive, and talk of ghosts felt indulgent when real hunger stalked every home. Yet hardship has a way of stirring old stories, and the Forsyth legend began to resurface, quietly, in whispers exchanged over ration lines and Sunday sermons. A county relief worker, Martha Ellis, kept a meticulous diary during those years. One entry from April reads, "Delivered food parcels north of Cumming. Heard sound like wind but steady, rhythmic. Farmer says it's the hollow breathing." She dismissed it at first, yet 2 months later she recorded the same sound again, this time describing it as a low wash, as though the earth itself were tidal. In early summer, state engineers arrived to assess potential drainage projects. Their maps labeled Forsyth Hollow as Zone 19C, Wetland Anomaly. The lead engineer, Robert Vail, described the site as an inland marsh with inexplicable salinity. When pressed by reporters, he compared it to the lingering mineral footprint of the Galveston hurricane, still echoing in the southern soil. The remark caught brief attention in regional newspapers before being buried under reports of failing banks and crop. Losses Vail's team conducted one preliminary dig along the southern edge. According to surviving field notes, they encountered water at just 4 feet, clear, odorless yet dense with salt. Vale himself wrote, "Unnatural clarity. Feels thicker than water." They withdrew after a small landslide nearly trapped 2 workers. Within days, the pit refilled on its own. Later that year, a rumor spread that Vale had resigned, claiming recurring dreams of waves underground. Whether true or not, he never worked for the state again. His assistant recalled him murmuring, "You can't drain what isn't finished." Meanwhile, the townspeople began noticing subtle changes near the hollow. Cattle refused to graze there. Lanterns dimmed when carried too close. Children claimed to hear distant bells beneath the soil. The sound came and went with the weather, never loud, never near, but always rhythmic, like something returning at its own pace. One evening in November, a passerby named Howard Greeley reported seeing movement near the reeds. A woman walking, head bowed, dressed dark and heavy. "Though the ground was mud," he called out, thinking she might be lost. She paused but didn't answer. He said the air smelled suddenly of salt and candle wax. When he stepped closer, the figure dissolved into fog. Greeley never returned to that road. His affidavit, submitted weeks later, was brief and formal, ending with, "There are things that follow rivers even when the rivers are gone." By year's end, Forsyth Hollow was once again left undisturbed, its reeds taller, its silence deeper, as though each generation had to relearn how to ignore what lay beneath. By 1934, Forsyth County had changed again. Paved roads connected towns, electric poles lined the hills, and people began to believe the world had left its old ghosts behind. But not everyone agreed. That spring, a WPA cartographer named Elliot Parrish was assigned to remap the northern marshlands. His assignment sheet included one brief notation: "Forsyth Hollow, verify boundaries." Parrish arrived in March, lodging at a farmhouse within sight of the hollow. In his letters to his wife, he described the landscape as peaceful, if strangely soundless. He spent 3 days surveying the perimeter and noted that his measuring instruments seemed to fluctuate unpredictably near the center. On the 3rd day, he recorded a distinct tremor beneath the soil, gentle, almost like the tide shifting on sand. His final entry reads, "Something moves below. Not earth, not water." When Parrish failed to report back to headquarters, a search party found his tripod and boots beside the fence. The ground there had collapsed slightly, revealing a pool of clear water no wider than a barrel. The next day it was gone, absorbed back into the earth. His disappearance was ruled an accident, but the clerk who closed the report later wrote privately, "He drowned without water." The following year, local historian Ruth Mallory compiled a pamphlet titled "The Forgotten Manors of Forsyth County." One short chapter referenced Clara Forsyth, calling her a daughter of the South who carried the storm within. She cited fragments from earlier sources, letters, diaries, and a 1902 affidavit by Constable Dawes. Though restrained in tone, the pamphlet rekindled curiosity. Copies circulated through Atlanta and Savannah, finding an unexpected audience among academics studying post-disaster folklore. In one lecture, Professor Millie Carver, the same folklorist who had visited the hollow in 1926, spoke of psychic saturation, describing certain landscapes as memory vaults for trauma. She mentioned Forsyth County by name, connecting its strange persistence of moisture to the Galveston hurricane, which she called the origin point of inland mourning. Her remarks drew criticism from scientists but fascination from writers. That summer, a reporter for the Savannah Morning News, Joseph Keene, traveled to Forsyth Hollow seeking a photograph for an anniversary piece on Southern legends. His surviving glass plates show only trees and fog, except one where faint ripples appear in the grass itself. Keene later wrote, "I could swear the ground was breathing." He sent the negatives to his editor and never pursued the story again. By 1936, the hollow was officially designated as protected wetland, ending all development in the area. The county cited unpredictable subsidence. Farmers near the boundary noticed that despite the dry years, the hollow never cracked. Even during drought, its soil glistened faintly in sunlight, and sometimes, when the wind moved across the reeds just right, listeners claimed to hear what sounded like the hush of waves, long, slow, patient, as if the sea was still deciding whether to take something back. By 1941, Forsyth County had almost forgotten its oldest ghost. War once again pulled its young men away. Factories replaced fields, and radio static filled the spaces where silence used to live. The hollow, fenced and unremarked, lay half-hidden behind thickets and reeds, its damp soil now a part of the county's natural order. To most it was simply another marsh, though the elders still lowered their voices when passing by. That spring, the State Hydrology Office ordered a routine survey of inland wetlands to assist with agricultural planning. 2 fieldmen, Ernest Cole and Walter Finn, were dispatched to Forsyth Hollow. Their notes, preserved in brittle paper at the State Archives, describe steady moisture, no visible source, slight saline content. But Cole's private diary, found among his belongings decades later, adds more ground soft. Heard faint pressure beneath, like something shifting. Smell of tallow and salt. They completed their survey, took photographs, and departed without incident. A week later, Cole reported recurring dreams. A woman standing by a window, waves reflected in the glass. He told Finn, who laughed and called it nerves. By mid-June, Cole drowned while fishing on Lake Lanier. His boat unturned, his body never recovered. When Finn filed the report, he included an unusual sentence. He said the water was calling him back. Later that summer, heavy rains returned to the county. For the first time in years, the hollow overflowed, spreading into nearby ditches and fields. Locals swore the runoff smelled faintly of seawater. No one approached until autumn, when the water finally receded, leaving behind a thin crust of salt across the grass, white, crystalline, glimmering under the sun like frost. The county issued no comment. The war deepened and attention turned elsewhere. Yet travelers still wrote small notes in their diaries about the strange stillness of the land, the quiet hum underfoot, the way light seemed to bend slightly over that stretch of ground. Truck drivers swore their engines sputtered there. Surveyors said compasses wavered. Some even claimed to see the faint silhouette of a woman through the reeds, facing east, as if listening for a tide no longer near. In 1949, the last official document referencing the site appeared, a maintenance memo stating that fencing remains intact, ground conditions stable, further inspection unnecessary. Beneath that, in pencil, someone had written, "Still damp." The file ended there. The county closed its archives to all but researchers, and in time even they forgot which cabinet held the records. The land settled into its quiet rhythm again, neither reclaimed nor abandoned, just waiting. And so the story of Clara Forsyth, of her house and her hollow, remains, a relic of that long-ago year when the sea tore through Galveston and sent echoes rolling far inland. They say that on certain nights, when mist crawls low and the air smells faintly of salt, a soft light flickers where the manor once stood. It's never bright, never near. Just enough to remind the living that some storms never end. They simply change their shore.